Welcome to Love, Laughter, and Limits. I'm Tom Dozier, and this lesson is The Launch, Behavior Science for Young Adults. Well, about young adults. This class will help you understand human behavior and why young adults do the things they do. From a behavior science perspective, I ask the question, what causes behavior? Is it the feelings? So feelings and then we have a behavior. Or is it the payoff? We do the behavior to get the payoff, or what the behavior produces. And from extensive research in this field, we find that it's the payoff that causes behavior, the consequence. Behavior results from a person's experiences. It's something we learn, and we learn what works and what doesn't work. And we do what works. We do what earns the payoff that we're looking to earn. Now, the ABCs of behavior is antecedent, behavior, consequence, or payoff. Antecedent is what's happening before the behavior, who's there, what's going on. B is the behavior, what the child does. And C is consequence or payoff, and that's what happens right after the behavior. It's the effect that the behavior produces. Now, there's something called setting events, and setting events are things that have a general effect on our behavior. Things like being hungry or tired, or feeling angry or upset, those would all tend to create more bad behavior. But being happy or excited or interested, those would all be things that would produce better behavior. So we have the antecedent behavior, consequence, and then we have this overarching setting events that affect our behavior. Now, any behavior that repeats serves a purpose. And there's only two purposes. The child either gets something he wants, or he avoids or delays something he doesn't want. And all of the payoffs can be lumped into those two categories: getting something we want, or avoiding or delaying something we don't want. Now, a behavior that occurs regularly is being maintained by a payoff. And this is called reinforcement. So you have the behavior, you have the payoff, getting something or avoiding something, and then we have the fact that the behavior occurs again and again. That's reinforcement. Now, we have aversive consequences, and when we get these aversive consequences and we don't want them to happen again, then we don't do what caused them. So technically, from a behavior perspective, punishment is where we have behavior, we have a bad consequence that we don't like, and the behavior occurs less. Now, if your child does something and you punish them, and the behavior keeps happening, then you've irritated your child, but you haven't really reduced the behavior or technically punished the behavior. You know, when you talk about punishing a behavior, it usually takes a pretty severe consequence. So if I'm cooking and moving my hands around in the kitchen and I touch the hot stove at the burner and I burn my hand, well, you know, I'm very careful about that in the future. And I don't do that. So that behavior has been punished. So once again, it usually takes a pretty severe consequence to reduce the behavior that way. Now, when a reinforcing behavior is no longer provided, the behavior will die away. And this is called extinction. So there's behavior, no payoff, and the behavior decreases, usually gradually. But beware of something called a behavior burst. You see, if I put money in the Coke machine and I hit the button and nothing comes out, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go bump, 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 bump. I'm going to hit that button 3 or 4 times, at least I will, and that is an increase of the behavior, right? That's called the behavior burst. And then sometimes behavior that's no longer paid off can make us upset, and we get upset. And so that also can happen. So if you're just taking away a payoff for a behavior, you have to beware of the behavior burst. Well, when I was first getting into this field, I got this fortune at Panda Express. It says, if you want something, you must earn it. And I thought, what an awesome fortune for a behavior scientist. You see, it's all about the payoff, the consequence, what it is that you're earning. And behavior earns a payoff. Now, have you ever asked yourself the question, what was that kid thinking? Well, for repeating behaviors, we really don't have to totally understand that question. We don't have to understand it very much at all. Because for repeating behaviors, regardless of what the child is thinking before, during, or after the behavior, it is the consequence, the payoff, that causes the behavior to occur repeatedly. And so we can often look at the payoffs and make adjustments to the payoffs if it's things that we control, and have a surprising effect on the behavior. Now, there's another class of behavior that's not learned directly, it's learned indirectly, and it's when we follow someone's advice. And if we're following someone's advice, we haven't really experienced it and experienced the payoff, but we're going to try it. And it's called rule-governed behavior. The advice is a rule. And remember, we work for payoffs. So if we trust the advice based on our experience and the relationship and the type of advice that we've received in the past and whether it's worked for us or not worked, well, based on that experience, we'll decide whether we think it's good advice or bad advice. And if we think it's good advice, then we may work for the payoff. Now, observing others, what pays off for them is kind of the same sort of thing. We haven't actually experienced it, but we think we're seeing the way things work. And so we will try it or not try it. And so beliefs also affect our behavior, but beliefs are learned. And so from our experience, we start to put together the rules that the world works by. And those are our beliefs. And we behave based on what we think the payoffs are going to be. Now, about giving advice to your young adult and whether they'll take it or not, the question is, does he trust you and your advice? What's his experience been with the advice that you've given him? What's the relationship and the trust that is between you and him? And the other question is your advice different from his opinion? Because if it is, a young adult's personal opinion is usually much more influential than your advice. And then still, if they want to take the advice, it still comes down to what kind of behavior is required and what kind of payoff is there for the young adult. It's all about the payoffs or perceived payoffs. Now, if we look at the payoffs and what drives our behavior, what rewards we're working for, what we find is if we look at positive versus negative, positive is more powerful. If we look at immediate payoff versus a delayed, we'll work harder for an immediate payoff. If it's certain versus uncertain, we're going to work harder for something that's certain. And if it's preferred versus non-preferred, we work for what we want to work for. That each individual has unique characteristics that decide what is it that we prefer and what do we not prefer. Now, we all work harder for bigger payoffs than large versus small. We work harder for the large. And if it's something we're deprived of, if there's a state of deprivation, then we have a much greater desire for it. That's actually a setting event. Versus if we're satiated or have had quite a bit of something, then it's not so unique and so desirable. So if we look at positive, immediate, certain, preferred, bigger, and something that there's a state of deprivation, then those are the characteristics that will drive the most behavior and the most behavior change. You see, for example, a negative delayed payoff, let's go from an adult standpoint, like having a heart attack from having high blood pressure or being overweight, is uncertain, and the taste of that donut or piece of cake is positive and immediate and certain and preferred, and that immediate influence just really tends to outweigh the delayed negative effect. The other thing that affects whether a person or a young adult will do or not do something is how difficult the behavior is. If it's something that's fairly easy, they're more likely to do it to work for the payoff. If it's something very hard, then they're less likely to do it. And that's based on their own ability. How much of the behavior is required? If they're going to have to work 40 hours to get $5, they're probably not going to do it. If they have to work 5 minutes to get $5, they're probably going to do it. So how much of the behavior is required? And then the last question is, can I get the payoff an easier way? So if I can get money from Dad by giving him a sob story, that may be much easier than working for the money. So if I can, why not use an easier way of getting what I want than a harder way? Now, I'd like to talk about another topic of behavior, and it's called coercion. What is coercion? Coercion is where we try to compel another person to act or choose a certain way. We're really trying to nullify their individual will in a matter. And in the case of kids, we're usually trying to make them do something or make them not do something. And the problem with coercion is that when you coerce a person, you get escape, avoidance, and counter-coercion, or getting even. Now, escape is escaping the pain of the coercion. We want it to stop. Avoiding is you just want to stay away from the person and the place that's giving you the grief. And then after a while, a person gets fed up and irritated, and we fight back, and we counter-coerce, or we try to get even. And so what you find with coercion and children, actually with spouses, with all, individuals who have some choice in the matter, is that you can get a short-term gain but a long-term loss. And so we really need to not use coercion with our young adults, because trying to force them, make them do it, you get this pushback, and it can make it much worse. Well, what do we do that's coercive? What are the things that we do? And generally, when we go to directly address a behavior problem, it's generally coercive. Things like criticizing a kid that they're too messy to go for a job interview, they're not dressed right, they're not doing enough schoolwork, they're not helping out around the house, they're not choosing good friends, they're choosing bad friends, they're anything we don't like, we criticize them about it. And sarcasm is just making a joke, trying to make a point. It's still criticism. Questioning, why haven't you registered? I thought registration started a week ago. You mean you haven't logged on the computer? What do you mean? And it doesn't go anywhere. Despair, I give up. I'm throw up my hands, I'm going to kick you out of the house. Logic, trying to talk them into it. Arguing with a kid about the fact that they need to do it, and they'll say no, they don't, or they want to do it, and you say no, they shouldn't. It doesn't go anywhere. Threatening them that if they don't do it, or if they do something, then something bad's going to happen. And generally, kids can see through the threats. They know our history, and they know whether we're going to do it or not. Trying to force a child to do something. Once again, yelling, screaming, pushing. Boy, talk about problems with young adults. If you start getting any kind of physical force, then you're going to have huge pushback. So totally avoid any kind of force, but especially physical force. And then nagging, and keep badgering them to try to get them to do it. And then guilt trips, trying to make them feel bad about it. You should be ashamed that you're blowing such a great opportunity. Other kids would love to have this opportunity. Yeah, it doesn't work. Coercion just doesn't work. Well, but what if your child does something you don't like? You almost feel compelled to respond to it. Well, first, if your child knows it, you don't need to say it again. If you said it before and it hasn't made things better, then don't say it again, because it's probably not going to make it better. And generally, coercion, and especially criticism, will make things worse. So, as Winston Churchill once said, life is fraught with opportunities to keep your mouth shut. When we look at the behavior science, and we have the basic ABCs of behavior and the setting event, we find that coercion is a setting event for bad behavior. It's upsetting, it's irritating, and it produces bad behavior. See, coercion also harms the relationship, and if you damage the relationship, then you have damaged your positive influence. And the closer you are to your child, the greater the positive influence you can have on your child. Now, I'm not asking you to do nothing, but what I'm suggesting is that you do something that will make things better. And we're going to talk about that, about what really works in the other classes. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about feelings. What about feelings? When it comes to, remember I asked the question earlier, is it feelings that cause a behavior, or is it the payoff that causes behavior? I guess it would really be then, is it feelings behavior, or is it behavior payoff? And the research shows clearly that it is behavior payoff, but feelings do come into play. And where feelings come from is we have this behavior, consequence or payoff, and feelings. Behavior, payoff, feelings. Behavior, payoff, feelings. And what you get is the feelings wrap around so that they actually start happening when the behavior is occurring or when the behavior is thought of or considered. And those feelings then influence the starting of the behavior, but it's the payoff and the feelings that go with the payoff that's really driving the behavior. So feelings is part of what makes the behavior payoff work, that it either increases the behavior or it decreases the behavior. So it's not that behavior is driven by the feelings, it's really more that feelings come from the behavior and it has a wraparound effect. Now, when it comes to our feelings, behavior changes feelings, and that's the best way to change the feeling about something, is to have a good experience with it rather than trying to talk it to death. Another behavior issue that has to do with feelings is about self-esteem. You know, is problem behavior caused by poor self-esteem? Well, there's a joke that a man went to a psychiatrist for help with an inferiority complex, a self-esteem problem. And after thorough examination, the psychiatrist came to the man and says, well, I have good news and bad news. He says, the good news is that you don't have an inferiority complex. The bad news is that you really are inferior. And poor self-esteem and behavior problems are really intertwined. They're interwoven. Remember, behavior builds the feelings, and if you build positive behavior, then you'll build positive feelings. And competence is really the best builder of self-esteem. So if a person is not demonstrating competence, it's really a false effort to try to tell them things to make them feel good about themselves. It's really much better to give them a job offer that they can't refuse so that they can demonstrate some competence, and then that will in fact improve their self-esteem. Now, self-worth, the inherent value of the person, is totally different than self-esteem. And that's really more of a personal belief, and a belief system is each individual of inherent value and worth. I believe that every individual is. And so I believe that every one of your well-behaving and misbehaving young adults has the same inherent self-worth or value, but I'm sure they have quite different self-esteems. So what has your young adult learned in their life up to this point? They've had a number of payoffs. They've done behaviors. They've had payoffs, but have the payoffs been predictable or unpredictable? Has it been behavior payoff, good behavior payoff, bad behavior, good payoff? You know, are the behavior and the payoffs contingent? And in this day and age, we often make the mistake of giving our kids everything we want them to have, and then we try to coerce them to do the things they need to do, and that's just not a good connection. So the payoffs are non-contingent, and then the coercion is contingent on their behavior. So they're really trying to avoid the coercion. So have they learned that good behavior produces good payoffs? Work and earn something good? Have they learned that good behavior and effort produces bad payoffs or no payoffs? That's a very bad lesson to learn, to try to put in some effort and do it and then get criticized for it or have it not pay off. You say, well, why work if it's not going to pay off? And that's really what your kids, especially those who are adrift or beyond the rough, those are really kids who have had problems with behavior and positive payoffs. If there's a problem with behavior, you can still help your child learn the connection between behavior and payoffs. And if there's a problem with his feelings or her feelings from the experiences that she has had or he has had, well, then you can still help that child to be put in a situation where they can have the right kind of experiences that will help them produce those improved feelings. Your child has all kinds of beliefs from his experiences, and those have developed through the way he's experienced the world, the people he's accepted advice from, and what he's come to think is true and not true. And we can't really change those beliefs directly. Sometimes we can affect them, but generally it's hard to directly change those beliefs. It's much easier to change the behavior and have the beliefs and experiences come from that. Now, if your child is doing well, then he has learned good lessons. Be happy for him. But if your child is not doing so well, if he hasn't really learned work and payoff, effort and good things happen, if he's learned bad lessons, then you need to have some compassion for him and be determined to help him have the opportunities that he needs to learn valuable lessons at this time in his life. So in summary, our behavior is learned. The behavior of your young adult is learned. She does what works. And she either gets something that she wants or she avoids or delays something. Remember, every repeating behavior, all repeating behaviors have payoffs. Now, the most powerful payoffs are those that are positive, immediate, certain, preferred, big, and where there's a state of deprivation, a setting event of a state of deprivation. And those are the most powerful payoffs to drive our behavior. Now, when it comes to coercion, coercion is trying to make our child do something. And the problem with coercion is it just doesn't work. It produces the child trying to get away from you and get away from the coercion, avoiding you, damaging the relationship in the process, and then the child is doing things to counter-coerce or get even. So coercion just doesn't work. We talked about feelings and behavior, and that feelings follow the behavior, and feelings are associated with the payoffs that the behavior produces. And then we talked about self-esteem, and the fact that self-esteem fundamentally comes from competence that's then acknowledged. And if we want to help a child with self-esteem, we need to help him with competence. So thank you for watching The Launch, Behavior Science for Young Adults. I'm Tom Dozier, wishing you an abundance of love and laughter in your family, along with limits, which we still need with these young adults to help them make the often difficult transition from dependent child to independent adult. Thank you.